He said, Nicolás Maduro, President of Venezuela, no one will take away our freedom. No one will take away the peace and independence of the country. President Nicolás Maduro spoke with the bluntness and defiance that have characterized his largest public addresses since he first rose to national office. The speech, at once patriotic, combative, and resolutely nationalistic, wove together themes that have become familiar in Caracas: sovereignty under siege, external pressure from the United States and its allies, and a narrative of rescue and redemption centered on Venezuelan citizens who had been detained abroad. The tone was not conciliatory. It was a performance designed for a domestic audience that has endured years of economic collapse, migration, and political fracture, and for international audiences watching an increasingly fraught relationship between Venezuela and a coalition of countries that have criticized Maduro's governance. The address sought to transform a humanitarian repatriation into a broader claim about national dignity and resistance. At the heart of Maduro's remarks was the return of 252 Venezuelans who had been held in El Salvador's Secot detention center. The government in Caracas framed their return as a rescue, a diplomatic and logistical operation that secured the safe homecoming of hundreds of citizens who, by Caracas's account, had been subjected to arbitrary detention, harsh treatment, and human rights abuses. The repatriation was widely reported by international media. The 252 men arrived in Caracas on flights that the government presented as a victory for Venezuelan diplomacy and for Maduro's insistence on protecting nationals abroad. Reuters Plus One, he said, Nicolás Maduro, President of Venezuela, we are supporting our rescue of these 252 boys who were kidnapped in El Salvador and whom we rescued safe and sound to return them to their families. Maduro's words alternated between rhetorical broadbrush and specific grievances. He invoked the language of family and protection. The children are sacred, he said elsewhere, and he used the repatriation to underscore a narrative in which Venezuelans abroad were vulnerable to policies and practices, particularly by other governments and agencies that Caracas has repeatedly framed as hostile. The president's claim that the hundreds were kidnapped spoke to a larger Venezuelan critique of how migration, deportation, and detention have been handled by the US and some allied governments in the hemisphere. That critique has two strands. First is a legal and procedural complaint. Caracas and allied human rights groups argued that several of the deportations and detentions had not followed due process and that people were sent to CECOT without an adequate chance to challenge the charges against them. Secondly, and more politically combustible, is Maduro's framing of the episode as a sign of a wider assault on Venezuelan sovereignty by imperial forces in the north, a phrase he used in caricature and in anger. He said, Nicolás Maduro, President of Venezuela, threats from the imperialist beast of the north only survive from other places, from their hideouts where they have politically self-disappeared. That line, both colorful and confrontational, summed up Maduro's long-standing geopolitical posture. For his supporters, it is a defiant stand against real geopolitical pressure, sanctions, diplomatic isolations, and criminal indictments that several foreign governments have leveled at Venezuelan leaders. For his critics, the rhetoric obscures internal accountability problems at home, arbitrary arrests, repression of opposition figures, and a judicial system critics say is used selectively to neutralize political foes. This is the narrow tightrope on which Venezuelan politics has been walking for years. Maduro's language of blood and fire and resistance is intended to consolidate a base that hears sanctions and diplomatic hostility as existential threats. It is a language that also rallies security forces and loyalist institutions by framing the state as under attack and in need of unity, popular military and police, to resist. He said, Nicolás Maduro, President of Venezuela, we must continue to defeat them through the path of perfect unity, popular, military, and police. That triad, people, military, and police, is more than a rhetorical flourish. It signals the continuing centrality of the security apparatus in Venezuelan political life. Over the last decade, the Maduro government has relied heavily on the loyalty of the armed forces and an organized set of citizen militias and security structures to stay in power. This speech reiterated that formula, unity at home under loyal institutions, will be framed as the best defense against foreign intervention and domestic destabilization. But inside those lines are policy realities. Venezuela has been economically battered, with millions emigrating during the country's economic collapse earlier in the decade. International sanctions have constrained oil revenues and foreign finance. The Maduro administration has, in recent months, sought to convert occasional diplomatic openings into political cover, even as it appeals to external actors to denounce the treatment of Venezuelan nationals detained abroad. The July repatriation of 252 Venezuelans and Maduro's insistence that it was a rescue therefore served multiple political goals at once. It was a humanitarian narrative for Venezuelan families reunited with relatives. It was a diplomatic achievement to present to an international audience that has sometimes dismissed Maduro as illegitimate. And it was a domestic political tool, a way to show tangible results to a public that has seen many promises go unfulfilled. At the same time, the facts behind the repatriation are complex. The deportations to El Salvador had roots in a US decision earlier in 2025 to use the rarely invoked Alien Enemies Act to deport hundreds of migrants with alleged gang ties. That action triggered legal challenges, criticism from human rights groups, and a regional diplomatic row. International watchdogs warned about the CECOT facility. Amnesty International said it would monitor the repatriated men's treatment and urged accountability for earlier deportation practices. The swap that freed the Venezuelans also involved the release of Americans detained in Venezuela. US officials publicly confirmed the release of 10 Americans as part of the deal. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and El Salvador's President Nayib Bukele were active in public comments about the exchange, which underlined how quickly migration, criminal justice policy, and international diplomacy have become entangled. Maduro used those facts to build a narrative of victimhood and counterattack. He argued that the imperialist campaign depended on scattered hideouts, political and media enclaves beyond Venezuela's control, and that they perpetuate threats not because of strength, but because of their ability to coordinate propaganda and political pressure from abroad. The rhetorical target was not only Washington, it included a constellation of regional actors whose policies, in Maduro's telling, have enabled the detention and ill treatment of Venezuelans abroad. Yet the speech was also an appeal. Maduro sought to convince ordinary Venezuelans he was defending their dignity and reuniting their families. He highlighted personal stories, fathers and sons coming off planes, children reunited with parents, small human scenes meant to cut through the bigger geopolitics. Those were likely the most effective lines for many listeners. The image of a child returning home after months of separation is immediate and visceral. He said, "Nicolás Maduro, President of Venezuela, there is a God and God sees everything." Even this religious turn has political function. It frames the repatriation as morally justified and suggests cosmic vindication for the government's efforts. For a domestic audience anchored in faith and family, that kind of language can resonate strongly. But there are immediate practical questions that flow from the celebratory rhetoric. Who will be prosecuted, if anyone, among those returned? Caracas has said most will be medically checked and released. Officials in Venezuela suggested only a small minority had serious criminal records. Independent monitoring groups, however, warned that the men should not be automatically cleared of allegations without transparent legal processes. The wider worry is that repatriation stories can be used by states on either side to paper over deeper, unresolved problems, arbitrary detentions, due process failings, and detention conditions that human rights groups describe as abusive. Diplomatically, the episode underscored the strange new alliances that have formed since 2024. The US, under its current administration, moved aggressively on deportations and on bilateral cooperation with governments in the region to tackle gangs and migration. Governments such as El Salvador's, which have championed hardline anti-gang policies, became central nodes in that strategy. Venezuela's counter-narrative cast those moves as geopolitical maneuvers designed to humiliate and destabilize Caracas. The repatriation also opened the door to a series of reciprocal demands. Maduro noted that other Venezuelans remained detained elsewhere. He said there were still children separated from families in the United States, and he used the moment to press for further returns. Those calls for more repatriations set up a diplomatic bargaining dynamic. Humanitarian returns, prisoner swaps, and political concessions all become part of the same ledger. He said, "Nicolás Maduro, President of Venezuela, We still have 29 boys and girls detained in the United States, separated from their families. That line was both a claim and a policy demand. It put pressure on foreign governments to address family separation cases and to avoid the kinds of deportation practices that had, in Maduro's account, precipitated the CECOT detentions. At the same time, it served domestic politics to show the government was vigilant and relentless in pursuing reunions. Critics of Maduro, however, read the speech differently. To many opposition voices and to independent watchdogs, the emphasis on external conspiracy and the focus on returning deportees risks obscuring a host of domestic human rights concerns. Venezuela itself has long been accused of holding political prisoners, restricting independent media, and using the judiciary against opponents. When Maduro's rhetoric frames every international dispute as part of an imperialist plot, it becomes easier to deflect scrutiny from internal reforms that might be necessary to rebuild institutions and public trust. Observers outside Latin America noted another risk: the normalization of prisoner diplomacy. The July swap, which tied the release of Venezuelans from El Salvador to the release of Americans from Venezuelan custody, created incentives for governments to use detainees as diplomatic leverage. That can bring short-term results, release citizens, grateful families, but it also makes hostage diplomacy a tool in bilateral relations with long-term damage to legal norms and human rights protections. Maduro's speech also highlighted another reality: the blurring lines between migration, criminal justice, and state security. The deportations that led to the July crisis were justified by US officials as targeting alleged gang members. The Trump administration invoked the Alien Enemies Act and accelerated removals. Those aggressive moves produced both legal pushback in US courts and a humanitarian outcry from rights groups. In turn, the plight of the Venezuelans in CECOT became a high-visibility test case for how regional partners manage complex migration flows. The political theatre of the repatriation was carefully staged. The government in Caracas showed images of planes arriving, of families at airports, and of officials receiving the returned nationals. Maduro's speech, fiery and personal in equal parts, was timed to amplify that imagery, to give the event a narrative shape that could resonate across Venezuelan television and social networks. He said, "Nicolás Maduro, President of Venezuela, no one will take away our freedom. No one will take away the peace and independence of the country. No one is anyone, whatever surname they have, whatever their name is. No one will take away from Venezuela with blood and fire." That long, defiant passage was both the high watermark of the address and a crystallization of Maduro's rhetorical strategy: to cast the state as inviolate and the nation as wounded but unbroken. For many in the government's base, such language evokes the Bolivarian era's historic claim to sovereignty and resistance to foreign domination. For opponents and many external observers, it reads as a warning that Caracas will continue to use muscular rhetoric and sometimes force to silence dissent. What happens next is uncertain. The repatriation relieved many immediate human tragedies. Families were reunited, and some of the men who returned told journalists of abuses they alleged occurred in CECOT. But the diplomacy that produced the exchange did not resolve the deeper questions that remain at the heart of Venezuela's crisis: electoral legitimacy, accountability for abuses at home and abroad, a battered economy, and the rule of law. Furthermore, the July swap created new diplomatic pressures. Caracas will press for further returns. Washington and its partners must weigh humanitarian claims against criminal justice concerns. El Salvador will face continued scrutiny over the conditions in its prisons and the broader conduct of its anti-gang campaigns. And international human rights organizations will press for transparency on both past deportations and future legal proceedings. Maduro's speech attempted to convert a single episode, the repatriation of 252 nationals, into a broader narrative of national vindication. It succeeded in delivering a clear message to its intended audience. The government can protect its citizens abroad. It will not allow outside forces to humiliate Venezuela, and unity at home, civilian, military, and police, remains the route to survival. But for Venezuela to move beyond symbolic victories, it will need more than rhetoric. It will require sustained reforms that address governance, judicial fairness, and human rights. It will require transparent investigations into alleged abuses, both abroad and at home, and it will require engagement with a region that has grown increasingly fragmented, where transactional diplomacy, hardline domestic policies, and geopolitical rivalry have turned migration and detention into instruments of statecraft. Maduro's address closed as it had opened, with forceful appeals to sovereignty and protection, with an insistence that the government had acted decisively to bring its people home, and with a warning that threats would be met with unity and preparedness. Whether that rhetoric will translate into lasting stability, improved rights protections, or deeper international engagement remains the central question facing Venezuela and its neighbours. He said, Nicolás Maduro, President of Venezuela, we must continue to defeat them through the path of perfect unity, popular, military, and police. The line left no ambiguity about the road he will continue to travel.